My name is Sirifan. I'm 75 years old, and I need to tell you tonight about the single most exhausting thing I did for most of my life. Not the hardest work, not the most painful experience, the most exhausting thing. The thing that cost me more energy than everything else combined. And it wasn't something that happened to me, it was something I did every single day without stopping, without knowing I was doing it. I forced everything. I forced situations to go the way I had decided they should go. I forced relationships into the shapes I believed they needed to have. I forced my own nature into the form that I thought was acceptable. I forced plans to work when they were showing every sign of wanting to go differently. I forced doors that would not open. I forced rivers to run uphill. And I called this effort. I called it determination. I called it being responsible and committed and refusing to give up. I dressed the forcing in the language of virtue and carried it through my life as though it was something to be proud of. And it destroyed me. Not all at once, slowly, the way water destroys stone, not by hitting it, but by wearing it, year by year. Forcing and forcing until what was being forced had no shape of its own left. Until I had pushed so hard against my own life that I had lost the thread of what it actually was. The Tao calls what I was doing Wei, and its teaching is about the opposite, Wu Wei, non-doing, non-forcing. The radical and counterintuitive practice of allowing things to move in the direction they naturally want to move, rather than insisting they move in the direction you have decided. This is not laziness. I want to say that clearly and firmly, because the misunderstanding of Wu Wei as passivity is the thing that keeps most Western minds from ever actually encountering what it is offering. Wu Wei is not doing nothing. It is doing what is natural. It is acting from alignment rather than from resistance. It is the difference between swimming with the current and swimming against it. You are still swimming. You are still moving, but one uses the water and one fights it. And the one that fights it arrives exhausted, if it arrives at all. Japan received the Tao and made it into an art, into the particular Japanese aesthetic of natural forms, of the asymmetric garden that looks uncultivated but is exquisitely arranged to appear so, of the flower arrangement that uses exactly 3 stems to suggest a forest, of the architecture that brings the outside in and lets the boundaries blur, of the martial art that uses the opponent's force rather than opposing it. All of these are expressions of Wu Wei, of the understanding that the highest skill is not the imposition of your will on what is there. It is the discovery of what wants to happen and the wisdom to allow it. To work with the grain of wood rather than against it. To find the line of least resistance and follow it, not because you are weak, but because you are wise enough to know that the path of least resistance is often the only path that actually leads anywhere. I discovered this teaching in my late 50s, after a collapse that was not dramatic enough to be noticed by anyone around me. No visible breakdown, no obvious crisis, just a morning when I woke up and could not find the force anymore. It was simply gone. I had been forcing something for 2 years, a relationship, a professional situation, a version of my life that I had decided was the right one, and that I was going to produce through sheer determination, regardless of the signals I was receiving that it was not working. And on that morning, the determination was simply absent, not chosen away, gone, like a muscle that has been used past its limit and simply stops responding. And in its absence, in that strange, empty morning, I felt something I had not felt in years, the absence of the forcing itself. And it was the closest thing to peace I had experienced in a decade. If something in what I'm describing is recognizing itself in you, if you know the particular exhaustion of forcing, then stay with me, because what changed after that morning is what I want to share with you. Not the collapse, the discovery. And if this space is giving you something real, come back to it. Because Wu Wei is not something you understand once. It is something you practice and forget and return to and lose again and find again. And having a place to return to matters. The first thing I had to understand about Wu Wei is what it is not. Because my mind, the forcing mind that I had been living inside for 50 years, immediately tried to co-opt the concept, to make non-forcing into another form of forcing, to make letting go into a technique I would apply with great determination, to make Wu Wei into something I would push myself to achieve. And this is the trap that the Tao is most difficult to escape, because the mind that forces cannot easily become the mind that doesn't. It can only pretend to. It can only perform non-forcing while still fundamentally operating from the same grasping orientation. The shift has to happen at a deeper level, below strategy, below technique, in the quality of your fundamental relationship to what is happening, in whether you are meeting life with insistence or with willingness. Willingness is the closest English word I have found for the quality of Wu Wei. Not willingness in the sense of agreeing to everything, not willingness that has no preferences or values or sense of direction. Willingness in the sense of being genuinely open to what is actually there rather than only to what you have decided should be there. The willingness of the martial artist who does not know in advance what the opponent will do, but who is fully ready to respond to whatever it is. The willingness of the gardener who plants seeds in the right conditions and then waits, without forcing the seed to germinate on her schedule. The willingness of the musician who has learnt the scales and the patterns, and then, in the moment of actual music, releases all of it and simply plays what wants to come. The second thing I had to learn is about the relationship between trust and Wu Wei. Because what prevents non-forcing is almost always distrust. Distrust that things will work out if you don't control them. Distrust that the situation has its own intelligence if you stop overriding it. Distrust that the relationship will find its own shape if you stop insisting on the shape it should have. Distrust that your life, trusted to move in the direction it naturally moves, will lead somewhere worth going. And this distrust is not irrational. It comes from experience, from the times when things did fall apart, when you stopped holding them together, from the moments when trust was violated, from the accumulated evidence that the world is not always safe, and that forcing is sometimes the only reason anything good happened at all. The Tao does not ask you to trust blindly. It does not tell you that everything will work out if you simply stop trying. What it asks is subtler and more honest than that. It asks you to notice the difference between the outcomes that came from forcing and the outcomes that came from allowing. To look back at your life and ask honestly, how many of the things I fought hardest to produce actually became what I wanted them to be? And how many of the things that arrived without my forcing, that I resisted, that surprised me by appearing when I had stopped looking, turned out to be the things that mattered most? This is not a philosophical question. It is an empirical one. And for most people who look at it honestly, the answer is more complicated than the forcing mind wants it to be. I looked at my life after that morning of collapse. I looked at everything I had forced, the relationship I had held together through sheer will until it broke anyway, later and more painfully than it would have if I had released it earlier. The career direction I had insisted on, despite every signal that it was not right, wasting years before I finally heard what was being said. The version of myself I had tried to make acceptable by suppressing the parts that didn't fit, losing years of genuine living to the performance of someone else's idea of who I should be. And then I looked at the things that had arrived without forcing. The friendship that appeared when I wasn't looking for it and has lasted 30 years. The work that found me in the year I stopped chasing the work I thought I should be doing. The understanding of myself that came not from pushing harder to be something, but from finally sitting still long enough to see what was already there. The third teaching of Wu Wei is about the signals. The Tao moves through things. It has a current, like a river has a current. And that current is not always moving in the direction you have decided is correct. And the forcing mind treats the fiction of going against the current as evidence that it needs to push harder, as evidence of its own resolve, as the price of commitment. But there is another interpretation. The friction might be information. The resistance might be the Tao's way of saying, not this direction, not this timing, not this form. This teaching does not mean that every difficulty is a sign to stop. Some difficulties are exactly the friction of doing something genuinely hard and genuinely right. But there is a different quality to that friction. The friction of doing hard work in alignment with what is true for you has a quality of energy. Even when it is difficult, it is somehow clarifying. It points somewhere. The friction of forcing something that is not right has a different quality. It is depleting in a way that goes beyond the ordinary depletion of effort. It feels like swimming against something that is not just difficult, but fundamentally uncooperative. And learning to feel the difference between these two kinds of friction is one of the most important skills Wu Wei can teach. I began to practice this in the smallest possible ways. When I noticed the particular quality of friction that signaled I was forcing, I would stop. Not forever, just for a moment. And I would ask one question. Is there another direction this wants to move? Not the direction I have decided, the direction it seems to want. And sometimes the answer was no, this is the right direction, and the friction is just difficulty, and I would continue. But more often than I expected, when I stopped long enough to feel the question, there was another direction, a softer direction, a direction with less resistance, a direction that the situation itself seemed to be indicating if I was still enough to notice it. And when I followed that direction, things moved differently. Not always easily, not without effort, but with a quality of rightness that the forcing had never had. A quality of the thing wanting to happen rather than being made to happen. The practice of Wu Wei in daily life is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is made of small moments of choosing not to force. The conversation you let unfold instead of steering. The decision you wait on instead of rushing. The relationship you allow to be what it is, instead of insisting on what you need it to be. The day you move through following what presents itself, instead of executing the agenda you arrived with. These small releases accumulate. They build a different quality of living over time. They teach your nervous system that the world does not require your constant intervention to function, that things can happen without your forcing them to happen, that the current is there, the Tao is moving, and your job is not to overcome it, but to find it and move with it. My name is Siripan. I'm 75 years old. I live in a small temple where the architecture itself is an expression of Wu Wei, where nothing forces, where the wood is shaped in ways that honor the grain, where the garden grows in ways that honor the slope of the land and the direction of the light, where the spaces are left open, because emptiness is not the absence of something, but the presence of possibility. And I have spent 15 years learning to live the way this temple is built. Not perfectly, with constant return to the old habit of forcing when I am tired or afraid or convinced that this situation is different and really does require my intervention. But more and more with the willingness to feel the current and follow it, to release the door that won't open and look for the window that will. To trust that the Tao knows something my forcing mind does not. And to rest each night in the knowledge that I did not spend today fighting the river, that I let it carry me, at least a little, in whatever direction it knew how to go. Before we part tonight, I want to ask you one honest question. Where are you forcing right now? Not in judgment, in genuine curiosity about the particular place in your life where you can feel the exhaustion of the current going against you, and your insistence on going against the current. You don't have to know what to do with it yet. Just name it. To yourself first, and then in the comments if you want. Because naming what we are forcing is the first step toward feeling what might happen if we stopped. And what might happen is almost always more interesting than what the forcing was producing.